What's up, YouTube? My name is Z with Z Sardar Photo, and today I wanted to take some time to talk about dynamic range and what exactly it is and how we can use it to take better photos. Dynamic range is a concept that might sound intimidating, but it's actually very easy to understand. And once you get a good grasp on what dynamic range is, you'll actually start noticing examples of it everywhere. You'll even be able to utilize your knowledge of dynamic range to start making smarter exposure decisions. And best of all, you'll gain a lot of appreciation for what the human eyes are capable of. Check this out. The human eyes have an incredible ability to perceive light across a wide range of lighting situations. The human eyes can actually pick up as little as a single photon in a dark room. On the other hand, if you were to walk outside in broad daylight where you're being blasted by trillions and trillions of photons, your eyes would be able to see just fine, picking up plenty of highlight detail as well as shadow detail at the same time. So when we talk about dynamic range, we're talking about that scale from dark to light that you can see or perceive simultaneously. Let me give you a quick example. Let's say you're sitting in a dark, shadowy room, and on one of the walls, there's a very bright window with a beautiful view behind it. As humans, our eyes will be able to pick up plenty of detail, both from the exterior or behind that window, as well as the interior, the dark, shadowy room. In other words, we'll be able to see everything just fine. We'll be able to see inside the room as well as outside the room at the same time. A camera, however, may struggle to do this depending on how steep that difference is from darkness to light. A camera will have to actually prioritize whether it wants to preserve highlight detail at the expense of delving the shadows towards black, or whether it wants to prioritize shadow detail at the expense of blowing the highlights out to white, which would result in some data loss. Now, I think the easiest way to understand dynamic range is just by looking at examples, so I'm going to give you more examples. Here's a photo of my wife on one of our recent vacations. Now, I chose this photo because you can see there's two completely different lighting situations all in the same scene. We have, just like our previous example, an interior lighting situation as well as an exterior lighting situation, or the outside. So in this particular photograph, you can actually see a good amount of detail both inside and outside. And that's because I edited this photograph to increase the amount of detail both in the highlight regions as well as the shadow regions. However, when I was there taking this photograph, that's not what I saw in my camera. When I held my camera up to this scene, I had to sort of prioritize what I wanted to capture. And by prioritizing, what I mean is I had to decide whether I wanted to preserve highlight detail at the expense of my shadows, or I wanted to preserve shadow detail at the expense of blowing my highlights out to white. At the end, I decided to prioritize preserving detail in the highlight region at the expense of making my shadows look a little darker, because I knew that if I were to blow my highlights out to white, that would be really difficult to recover in post-editing. On the other hand, I know that detail that's masked in the shadow regions can easily be pulled out in post-editing. Now, it is possible to utilize high dynamic range photography techniques if you're interested in capturing both highlight detail as well as shadow detail and then combining them into a single photograph. However, in an effort not to confuse things, we'll save that for another video. Now, when it comes to measuring dynamic range, we use the terminology stops. A stop is how we measure a change in light in photography. A stop is defined as either a doubling or halving of light. So for example, let's take a look at this scene. If I decide that I want to increase the exposure of light hitting my camera sensor by one stop, that means I want to double the amount of light that's coming into my camera and reaching my sensor. So the scene will look like this. Now, let's say I want to take the same scene and increase the exposure by 3 stops. So now what I'm effectively saying is I want to double the amount of light reaching my camera sensor 3 times over. So times 2, times 2, times 2. Now this is a topic that we can save for another video. However, briefly, if you want to increase the amount of light that's reaching your camera sensor, there's 2 ways to mechanically do this. First, you can make your aperture wider, or you can slow down your shutter speed, allowing more light to get past the shutter curtain and reach your sensor. So now that we have a grasp on the terminology, let me tell you this. The human eye can actually perceive a scene where the brightest part of the scene is 20 doublings of light brighter or more intense than the darkest part of that same scene. In other words, the human eye has a dynamic range of anywhere from 18 to 20 stops. That's a lot. Cameras, on the other hand, typically have dynamic ranges anywhere from 12 to 14 stops. Now, when you start to interpret scenes and lighting situations the way that your camera does, you'll start to realize that the limited dynamic range of your camera can be a very useful composition tool. Embracing dark shadows and bright highlights can really bring out a lot of drama, a lot of emotion in your photography. Now, one thing that's important to understand is photographs are not realistic representations of reality. And what I mean by that is there are numerous factors that make a photograph or make what a camera sees different than what we see and what we perceive. For example, we already know the dynamic range now is far more limited than what our human eyes are capable of seeing. But in addition to that, your lens choice may add a certain amount of compression or distortion depending on which focal length you go with, thereby changing what the scene looks like. In addition to that, the colors may also not be that accurate. You might only choose a very small cutout of the scene to show people. And obviously, a photograph is 2-dimensional, where a real scene in real life is 3-dimensional. Now, there's also a number of other factors that may impact the realism of your photo, but that's my point is you can strive to make your photograph look as real as possible, but you could also gain control of each of these little factors that makes a photo different and utilize it as a photographer to create or express exactly what you want to. If you want to make a scene more dramatic or inject a certain amount of emotion into a scene or frame a scene a certain way, you have the power to do that. From very simple scenes to very complex scenes, it's up to you to make those choices as a photographer. Understanding dynamic range provides you as a photographer yet another tool that you can exercise to express your creative freedom. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you made it this far, please let me know down in the comments what video topics you would like to see next. And if you're a photographer, how do you let dynamic range influence your photography? Anyways, guys, my name is Z with Z Sardar Photo. I'll catch you guys in the next video.